With a general election on the way, all eyes and ears are trained on what our politicians are saying about the future of education and skills. However, there are plenty of other important individuals who you won't see in the political spotlight, but are nevertheless thinking hard about how to improve the life chances of the most disadvantaged children, young people and adults. One such individual is Alun Francis OBE, the Principal and Chief Executive of Blackpool and the Fylde College, and also the Chair of the Social Mobility Commission. The Commission is funded by government but acts as an independent body to promote social mobility in England, carry out research, publish annual reports on the progress being made with social mobility, and provide advice to ministers on how to improve social mobility. As Alun has just completed his first year in the hot seat at the Social Mobility Commission, I thought now was the perfect time to get his views on some fascinating policy issues. Where have we got to with social mobility? Do we actually know if social mobility is getting better or worse? And what would make for a really strong agenda on improving social mobility going forward? I'm Tom Richmond, the director of the EDSK think tank, and to hear what the chair of the Social Mobility Commission thinks about social mobility in this country, let's go inside your ed.
Welcome to Inside Your Ed, the podcast from the education and skills think tank EDSK that looks inside the latest stories from across the education system in England, including schools, colleges, universities and apprenticeships. You can find out more about EDSK's research at edsk.org or on Twitter at EDSK Think Tank.
Alun, welcome to Inside Your Ed. It's very kind of you to take the time out of your busy schedule to join us for our podcast today. Let's kick off our conversation with a little bit about you and why you wanted to get involved in the Social Mobility Commission, because as a college principal, you clearly have a very, very busy day job. So what was it that made you keen to take on this extra role?
I suppose I've probably always been interested in social mobility in one way or another, but the vast majority of my life, I've lived in places which would be regarded as not having great social mobility, and I've certainly worked in areas and with people where that would also be the case. And I've been in further education since 2010, and my particular interest peaked when I noticed that social mobility awards were being given out to educational organisations who I thought, well, actually, that's not what I've always thought social mobility really ought to be about. And they would be organisations that particularly were focused on kind of conventional A-level university route. And they were kind of seen as social mobility particularly because they were in a place where you might argue that social mobility was not as strong, but they were focused very much on those who are going to do well already. They're already, the people that they're working with are already on their way. And so I'm kind of looking at the people that come into our colleges and thinking, well, what does social mobility mean then for them if it's predominantly focused on that kind of elite university, elite professional route? And when I started to do more reading about it, I kind of thought, well, actually, quite a lot of policy is focused on that, and quite a lot of the debates in the academic world are focused on, well, they're really focused on the numbers of people from poor or relatively deprived backgrounds who can, through education, achieve that upward mobility, which really does mean entry to university and then from there on into those professions. And I'm not arguing that isn't important, but I just think that affects quite a small number of people. We might argue that it should be more people, but actually when you get into the mud, kind of looking at how this all works, you think, well, there's an awful lot of people whose social mobility doesn't mean that for lots and lots of different reasons. And actually perhaps social mobility policy ought to be talking to them as well. So I'd read quite a bit of stuff the Social Mobility Commission did. I then wrote an article for Policy Exchange, which kind of puts out some of my kind of views at that point. It's a bit rough around the edges in some respects, but I think expressed some of my feelings about, well, social mobility really ought to capture the kind of what was at the time being called levelling up, terms kind of getting used less now, but I think we know what we mean by it. The idea that some places and some people are getting left behind in terms of opportunity, and I felt that social mobility ought to have that focus. So I applied, was interviewed, as I have been for every other job I've ever done. And fortunately was given the opportunity to become Deputy Commissioner and then subsequent to that to chair the Social Mobility Commission, which I've now done for some months. So that in short, Tom, is how I got interested.
We are obviously very passionate about this area and this issue of social mobility. But for me, this term social mobility seems to occupy quite a tricky space in political conversations, particularly because politicians and parties are always very keen to talk about the importance of social mobility, which on the one hand is encouraging, but they also talk about social justice. They talk about inequality. They sometimes talk specifically about income inequality and maybe international comparisons of that nature. So how easy is it to define social mobility in this context? How would you capture social mobility in a way that's perhaps distinct from these other widely used terms?
Well, I'm glad you've asked that question because it's a really important one, but it's also very tricky. And in the way that people talk about social mobility in a kind of a popular sense around these policy areas, it is used in very elastic ways. And that is part of the problem. As you pointed out, it's often used interchangeably with a set of other terms which don't actually quite mean the same thing. But in short, you can define it. There are definitions that academics have had for a while. There's these technical terms they use. So they have absolute social mobilities when you look over time at someone or a group's improvement, and relative social mobility when you compare the opportunities between different groups. So you then say, for example, you'd compare your chances of getting into a high-paid professional job compared to comparing one group who are born into a family that already does them compared to another group whose families don't, and you compare the kind of odds between them. So that's relative and absolute. And then you've got intra and intergenerational. So intra is your social mobility in your lifetime, but inter is compared to your parents. And there's a lot of measures around how that might be done well. But then that's the definitions, but then there's different measures about, how are you going to measure the social mobility? So the most commonly used one is occupations. There's a big sociological tradition around using occupations because in one sense they're easier to identify, and because of the work that people like John Goldthorpe, for example, did, who's the kind of pioneer in this field, he was able to develop a kind of occupational schema that linked it to social class and the security of employment and the nature of employment, which implies therefore some benefits in terms of income and so on. However, income is another measure, and if you look at American data on this, they have very good income data. So they use that a lot in terms of social mobility. I would argue that income actually might be a better measure than occupation because occupations are not as easy to define, and you get lots of crossovers where you think an occupation might be one place in the kind of sociological hierarchy, but actually earns much more money than an occupation that seems to be higher. So the example I would give is I don't know a plumber who doesn't earn more than a primary school teacher, but in the occupational schema they'd be in different social classes. So I think income is probably better, but our income data in this country is not good enough to be really reliable in terms of showing that over generations for some complicated reasons. But then there's other measures. I mean, income is often kind of, we would see it as a really useful measure of saying, well, how much you earn is telling you how better you've done compared to the circumstances you were born into. But actually, that's quite different from wealth. So wealth includes your inherited wealth, your housing wealth, a range of other things, which is not just about income. And then the other measure that's very, very important, is increasingly important, is your educational status. So the acquisition of qualifications is now increasingly a gateway to social mobility. So you can use all of those different measures, and then you've got those different kind of technical terms. So yes, you can define it, but sometimes it means things that are quite different to the way the term is used in a more popular sense, where people do just mean, well, they really mean opportunity. I think they mean giving people a chance to improve their situation. And I kind of lean towards a more popular view in a way, because my concern is that too much of the debate focuses on the very narrow concept of social mobility, which is relative mobility, comparing one group to another. And as I said at the beginning, that I think can lead us to focus too tightly on one group and ignore everybody else. It's also beset with problems about definition, because although we might think, well, that these things are easy to measure, when you get into the details of definitions, life is so much more complicated. So, for example, if you decide let's look at social economic background, for example, what measures do you have? Well, occupations is the one the sociologists take, but I've already implied, yes, but there's a hierarchy in those occupations, and actually not every occupation fits that neatly. They tend to take the parental occupation of the father. That has been the traditional way. I don't think families are like that anymore. You could have a mother who's a higher earner. It could have a mother who's a single parent. It could have a divorced family. Who do you take then? What happens if you've got a stepdad and a dad? There's so many more complications to these measures. And many of the things then that people use are proxies like free school meals, or if you look at other indicators of disadvantage, they might use geographical basis of where you live, the ward you live in, and so on. They all shed some light on people's circumstances, but they're all slightly flawed. So this becomes an important point when you start to think about turning from the kind of general trends, which you can see in the data, to specific interventions, because you can start to get very muddled, I think, about where you intervene and with who, because most human beings' lives are not average in any respect. So very few people conform to the kind of stereotype patterns, and those patterns can be a bit of a caricature. Particularly when you start to look at the binary way sometimes the distinctions are made between kind of disadvantaged and advantaged. So disadvantaged in our educational world is often described in terms of free school meals. It's not always a reliable measure. It misses out some people who are quite poor. It's also a bit elastic. It tends to grow. But it also implies that lots of people, that everybody who's not on free school meals is all of the same status or income, and that just isn't true. The fact is that some people doing in the middle are quite different to people at top who might have quite a lot of privilege by comparison. So I think there's a complexity to this which really is quite difficult to get hold of, and that complexity matters when you start to think, well, where should you intervene and for who? Because when you make recommendations about interventions, you're actually saying, well, we want to help some people over others, and who that should be is quite a difficult question to ask sometimes.
Well, what you've outlined there is a set of really interesting but potentially quite thorny logistical challenges around capturing that social mobility. And like you say, when it then starts to pose challenges about what we do about it, that gets even more tricky for policymakers, sort of past, present and future. So from your work at the Commission, what do we know about how social mobility has changed in recent years? Can we say anything definitive, given those definitional challenges, about whether mobility is actually getting better or worse?
I think we can. So our most important piece of work is our State of the Nation report, which is an annual report to Parliament. And in the 2023 report, I think we've, for the first time, really collated all of the key indicators around social mobility into one document. I think from that, the first important point that comes out is that there is no convincing evidence that social mobility is in decline, although that is commonly cited as the case in the UK. Nor is there definitive evidence that the UK is worse than other countries, although that is often cited to be the case too. I think there's interesting explanations as to where this decline narrative has come from, but I think the important point to make is the evidence doesn't support it. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be trying to improve social mobility, but it does mean let's be accurate about what the evidence is telling us. Let's not tell a story that's not true. I think telling a story that's not true is not helpful to anybody, particularly if you're presenting a dismal story to people who are working very hard to change their lives. And what we don't want to be telling them is that, well, it's not really worth it because the data says it's not going to happen for you. That is a very unhelpful starting point. And I think you can understand somebody in education would not want to be promoting that kind of view of opportunity when it isn't true. We want people to have a realistic chance of doing well. That being said, what does emerge from the evidence is a mixed story in terms of who's doing well and who isn't. And whichever way you chop the evidence, by ethnicity or gender or socioeconomic background, there are some people who are doing well and some people are doing less well. So I think we capture in the report, there's some groups by ethnicity, particularly Chinese and Indian heritage young people, who are doing extremely well compared to everybody else. Interestingly, Chinese children on free school meals do actually better than Chinese children who are not on free school meals, and they do better than everybody else. So there's some really interesting ways in which it cuts across the different equalities characteristics, really. So you can't really reduce the story to one or the other. You can also find, particularly in terms of educational outcomes, women and girls doing much better than boys and men, although that's not fully translated yet into the workplace, that is changing. In terms of social background, you can see the broad picture that the more disadvantaged you are, the less likely the outcomes are going to be that you can make that kind of long upward mobility. But it's not a binary picture. It's not a picture of there's two groups competing against each other. It's graduated. It's more like a spectrum, and we try and show that a little bit in the report. But nor is the link between social background causative. It's a correlation, and that's quite important because there is one aspect, I think, of the whole story about social mobility that is mentioned but not with sufficient weight. And the one I would really strongly emphasise is the importance of geography and place. And I think this really cuts across some of the other characteristics. So you'll find, for example, that if you are going to grow up in a poor family, much better that you grow up in some of the inner London boroughs if you want to go to university or get a professional job than if you were to grow up middle class in the northeast, for example. You'll have better chances. Now that's really quite, not alarming, but quite a thought-provoking position to have, because actually the geography does mean that you have to reevaluate what you think of as the kind of weight that you give to gender, to social economic background, and to ethnicity, because place is key to understanding the variations in those and the different combinations in which they work. And I think if there was one thing I would want to do is leave a legacy of saying, well, actually, this is best understood not as one national social mobility problem, but a social mobility problem that has got a very strong place-based aspect to it. And I think that runs quite deep in terms of where we need to look for solutions.
Well, going on to those points around solutions, based on the Commission's work, what can we say at this point about the factors that can improve social mobility? You've mentioned some of the hurdles that the data says might be facing some particular groups of people, but are we any closer to understanding what can drive mobility upwards, either for particular groups or just in general terms?
I think there is already a body of evidence around, for example, the importance of early years, to say we know that's important. We know it's important for cognitive and non-cognitive development. And therefore, what we really do need to do is make sure we focus early years interventions, whether it's through the family or through public provision, on ensuring that it's focused on improving those cognitive and non-cognitive skills. Whether all early years provision does that or not, I think is an interesting question. So we did a rapid evidence review of Sure Start, for example, which is often cited as a good solution to the problems of early years. And actually, Sure Start had many strengths, but many limitations. And actually, whether it impacted on cognitive and non-cognitive skills is a moot point. It impacted on lots of other things like health outcomes and so on. But whether it was the answer to this problem about closing the gap around cognitive and non-cognitive skills is not so clear. So there's a question there, I think, that policymakers sometimes miss about if early years is so important to developing those early skills, then should we not be evaluating our early years interventions more rigorously against the impact they have on that? So I give you a good example about childcare. Expanding childcare could have many benefits for many families and many people in terms of developing their careers. But we shouldn't forget that we should be asking the question of, is that impacting in a positive way on developing those early skills of children? And the answer to that is not always that straightforward. So we know early years is important. We also know, obviously, that the importance of schools is very central. In my world, in post-16, I think that we do need to see some shifts towards a wider variety of choices post-compulsory education in terms of the routes to work. I think that the university route has lots to commend it, and in some areas it's absolutely the right route. But I think there's a need for more flexibility, a wider range of multiple routes to higher skilled employment, including apprenticeships and other options, which I think are very, very important in terms of making sure that people have got those kind of opportunities to find their skills and not all be judged by the same characteristics, so that there are different talents people have, and there's the application of talents, there's theoretical talents, and there's academic skills, and there's technical skills, and the workplace requires all of those in different combinations, and that perhaps is an important part of that. But if I was to say where I think some of the really big challenges come in, I would say there's two aspects of social mobility that I think are very important outside of education. One is the family, and the other is the economy. And I don't think they're unconnected. I think one of the areas that we are going to be looking at is trying to build some perspective of social mobility from the bottom up, if you like, in terms of how it happens in particular places. And if I pick up the theme we talked about earlier, it is very clear that the great success which many women have had in terms of upward mobility has meant that there's been some significant changes to families. And there's a really good Institute of Fiscal Studies report that came out a couple of years ago that looked at families and inequality and contrasted graduate with non-graduate families. And very broadly, and I am caricaturing slightly, graduate couples will tend to meet each other at university or in the workplace. They'll start to work, possibly buy a house together, have a child, and possibly get married after that point, and in that order. And the age at which they have the children will be slightly older. If you look at what's happened in non-graduate families, and there's a geographical aspect to this too, obviously the graduate families are also more mobile, so they're able to go and look elsewhere for work. But non-graduate families, there's quite a different story. The story is that the mum's often left on her own before she's finished her education. So I'm not talking about all single parents here. I'm talking about, there are single parents who have separated and divorced, the single parents who have got their education and their qualifications. I'm talking here about non-graduates who haven't got those higher level skills at that point. They're having the children a bit younger. The dads are not present. Those families are in a much more difficult position in terms of opportunity for lots and lots of reasons. But what is quite shocking is the economic aspect of that. So when you map that across to the geography of where those families are, you'll find an awful lot of them in post-industrial towns and coastal resorts. And that, for me, is where the whole issue overlaps with the issue about economic opportunity for those who stay. And it feels like we've got two very different trajectories there, one of which works very, very well for many people, and one of which works much less well. So, in fact, if we want to really get to the bottom of who has the least options in terms of social mobility, I think looking at those places and people who are sometimes referred to as the left behind, I'm sure it's a great term, but you know what I mean by it. I think that perhaps is where we need to start to focus our efforts in terms of thinking how we can improve opportunity for everybody. And that may not mean long mobility for everybody, but it does mean we shouldn't be accepting that that is the best outcome that can be had for those families. We've got to find some better solutions for their children and for the adults involved.
Well, just building on that point around opportunities, you've already mentioned geography as something that you're particularly keen on to bring to the Commission's work. But when we're talking about what we do know about social mobility and trying to measure it, I think it's also worth pausing to consider what we really don't understand very well about this important topic. So given your work as chair of the Commission over the past year, what areas do you still look at and go, we really just need to get a much better grip on this topic, or that we make perhaps too many assumptions about a particular issue without the level of rigor and detail that you're now trying to bring? Where would you say that we're still collectively lacking a good understanding of some aspect of social mobility?
That's such a good question, Tom, because the more I've read on this and the more I've looked at it, I can think we just don't know enough about any of it. So there's more we don't know than we do. There is an absolutely enormous academic literature on social mobility from the point of view of sociologists and economists and others in the field. And when you start to dig into it, they've researched so much and shed quite a lot of light on so many important things. So what I'm going to say isn't meant to suggest that, to imply any criticism on that front. The literature is massive. But in terms of the policy area, there's also an awful lot we just don't know. So I'll just run through a few and throw them out, because I think people listening might find, they would think, oh, I recognise that. So we talk a lot about social background as being a defining characteristic, and it is in a very general sense. But then when we break that down to the level of families, we don't know a great deal about, which families are able to make their way out of poverty most effectively, because we do know, for example, that Chinese families and Indian families are doing really, really well. And Chinese families, despite the fact that they're often poor, we do know that some families, their poverty is temporary and other families get stuck. So we really need to understand that better. There's an issue there about what's going on in the family. There's an issue about education, attainment in the family. There's also, though, we need to understand differences between children, because the outcomes within this particular family are not always the same. So we know that firstborns sometimes do better than the rest of the family. We know that summerborns find it more difficult. We know that larger families, there are issues in terms of the extent to which opportunity is equal across the family. There's so many of these questions that we don't fully understand. There's some interesting questions about the difference in terms of gender. I'm particularly interested at those who seem to be at the bottom, which is in our country. It's interesting that the white middle classes are at the top of everything and the white poor are pretty much at the bottom of everything. And the girls often have a worse deal than the boys by the looks of it. Now, that's not to say they're the only groups that are important. There's also alongside them, Black Afro-Caribbeans doing less well, for example, than Black Africans. And we need to understand those differences and what's sat behind them, and not just read them off on the stats. Really, there's a lot of qualitative issues in there that we need to understand as well. So those are some flavours, and then the other side, I think, is really understanding how this operates at the level of a place. So I can tell you in quite a lot of detail about two places I've worked in recently. As you know, I worked in Alun for a long time and now in Blackpool. On the one level, they're very similar, and another way, they're very, very different. And I think really getting to grips with understanding how that happens and how we end up in a situation where you've got those real differences in terms of opportunity, it then helps you. It doesn't give you an easy answer, but helps you to start to formulate some of the strategies that perhaps can help move away from that. But one of the things I have learned is that there are no easy answers, and what we must avoid doing is thinking in a lumpy way about these problems. They're nuanced, they're quite complex, and we need to start to really unpick some of the kind of qualitative as well as quantitative issues in terms of who does well and what we can learn from that in terms of those who are really disadvantaged. And because there is a clear problem in our country about kind of bottom 20, 25%. We know about them in FE because they come along with some of the others who are doing very well into post-16 with low literacy, low numeracy. They're very susceptible to getting low-paid jobs and are very dependent on welfare, and their families often end up in a cycle of low opportunity as well. And it feels to me that nationally across the country, that's a big challenge, and it's certainly a big challenge in those areas I've talked about, the post-industrial, the seaside towns and rural areas, and we need to understand that much better.
It sounds as though there is, as you say, a lot of complexity here. There are some areas we don't understand, some areas we like to understand more, and there are also other areas, conversely, where actually we do have a reasonable grasp of perhaps the factors and drivers that do help social mobility go upwards. But then, of course, the flip side of that is that there are some factors and drivers that may push social mobility downwards in either a narrow or a broad sense, depending on what we're talking about. So is there anything happening in the policy world right now that concerns you about its potential impact on social mobility? Is there something happening, do you think, is likely over time to have a detrimental impact on social mobility from what we can see already?
There's quite a number of areas. I mean, I think there's some contemporary current issues that are very pressing. Obviously, the whole impact of 10 years of quite a lot of instability in terms of the kind of wider environment. So we've had, since 2008, we've had a financial crisis. We've had a real problem of low productivity, pressure on public spending, we've had a global pandemic, a cost of living crisis. Those in themselves are challenges, but they're also a challenge around finding good solutions because they create both policy churn, which is not helpful. So we never seem to be able to see something through. Things change too much change going on all the time, so we're not sure what works. And that is a real challenge in terms of creating some stability. So one of the things I think that's important is start to get some long-term stability so that we're not constantly chopping and changing all the time. I think the big challenge in our country that isn't going away is the one about regional disparities. But it's going to be a very difficult one to solve. It's not got any easy answers to it. But it's certainly something that is definitely framing opportunity across the country, and really the question there is about how much talent we're wasting because we aren't able to resolve some of those problems. And then I think there's some very practical parts of that too. So if you ask me certain practical policies, I think we need stronger policies on families and how we're going to support families, given that they are the first carers for our children, and that we look at a lot of interventions around families, but we perhaps need a policy about the family. I also think that we need to think about the way in which funding is carved up across the different phases and sections of education. So I think it is a problem that early years and further education are treated as the Cinderellas compared to schools and universities. I'm not saying schools and universities have an easy time of it, but honestly, early years and further education are funded at a much worse rate, and that is not a good thing. Particularly, I think, in post-16, where you have the dual challenge of helping find people's careers and the pathway to work, but also helping a lot of people catch up and get their second chance. And that's got to be an essential part of any social mobility policy. So those are some of the reflections. And finally, I suppose I'd say we need to find some ways of building social mobility into place-based strategies so that we recognise not everywhere is the same, and that different places need to grapple with this in a different but nuanced way. And finally, those challenges should be always about developing the skills and capacities of individuals and really focused on making those happen. And sometimes that isn't what happens in our system. We look at league tables which drive people, institutions to look at their performance. We look at the way in which a lot of the kind of funding and measures work. I think there is probably a group who come through public provision from early years through junior school, secondary school, into post-16. It's the same people tending to get the worst deal all the way through. And there's something there that needs sorting out in terms of making sure that we can develop those human beings so that they can actively go into the labour market, earn a living, stand on their own 2 feet and be confident in the abilities they've got. And unfortunately, for too many people, that doesn't happen.
I'm sure lots of our listeners will be nodding along to quite a bit of that in terms of where we might go next. We are sadly almost at the end of our conversation, so I've got one last question for you for today. I mean, your own career is fascinating. It spanned further education, place-based regeneration, youth work, local government, and much more besides. So you clearly have a very strong grasp of what social mobility looks like in practice, not just in theory. I think it's fair to say that politicians talk a lot about social mobility. I think that's generally a good thing. But if a politician, say, came to visit your college one day and you struck up a conversation with them, what would they have to do to convince you personally that they really are serious about social mobility and not just paying lip service to it? What would it take to persuade you that they really get the essence of social mobility?
I think that my experience is that our politicians of all persuasions who are actually very serious about this, I'm not always sure that we have a coherent framework for working on that. And I think people have different focus on different parts of the story. Even in talking to you, I've focused very much on those in the bottom. There is another aspect to this story about, well, how porous is our elite? How open is it to people moving into it? And I think that's another podcast for the day, perhaps, in terms of how that works. But I do think there are people that are very concerned about it. And I do think that is very much heartfelt. I do sometimes think it's a bit factionalized in terms of what people see as the solutions. And I think if I was to say, to use an old-fashioned phrase, some people see it as all a bit structural and some people see it all as a bit cultural and agency. And both of those stories are important. What we need to try and understand is how the two interplay together. Why is it that some people exert their agency and are able to change their stars and move out of their situation, and others find that so much more difficult? And that's what I would say. I would take somebody very seriously if they started to talk about that. And I think there have been people that have done that. I think there's been politicians that have done that. And I think, I look at the work of people like Frank Fylde. I've learned a lot from reading his work. I thought he did some really interesting things. I think there have been others in other fields that have done some interesting stuff too. But I think that's where we need to focus and not to kind of end up thinking that, well, it's all explained by one approach rather than the other. I think it's about really trying to get underneath this problem and see if we can get some long-term solutions.
What a fantastic place to finish up our conversation today. Alun, thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule to join us on Inside Your Ed to share your experience and expertise on social mobility. It's been absolutely wonderful to have you on. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tom. You're welcome.
That brings us to the end of this episode. If you enjoyed today's discussion with Alun, then please do give us a good rating on iTunes or Spotify so that our podcast can reach more education enthusiasts. And don't forget to hit subscribe to make sure you join us when we next go inside your ed. Bye-bye for now.